Salamu alaikum friends, how are you? This is Latte Science with a Muslim faith. Please subscribe to this for believing on Allah with proofs. Today we will discover about what happens after death. Do we go to God? Or do we end after we die? Subscribe to Late Science and let's go. The auditorium lights dimmed slowly, leaving only a soft glow on the stage. Rows upon rows of chairs were filled with people from every corner of the world. Scientists in neat suits, students with notepads ready, journalists with cameras, and ordinary men and women who had come with a simple yet profound curiosity. The hall, located in the heart of London, carried the air of both academic seriousness and spiritual hunger. It was not just another conference. It was a gathering where one of the oldest, deepest, and most uncomfortable questions in human history would be placed on the table. The large screen behind the stage lit up with bold words. What happens after death? Science versus belief. A hush fell over the hall. It was as if the audience instinctively understood the gravity of the moment. Death, the one certainty that unites every human being regardless of race, religion, or status, was about to be discussed, not in whispers, but openly, critically, and globally. From the left side of the stage, the moderator stepped forward, a tall man in his 50s, with gray streaks in his hair and a calm, commanding voice. He adjusted the microphone and smiled briefly at the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Tonight we explore a question that touches every life, every culture, and every faith. A question no science experiment has been able to fully answer and no belief system has been able to avoid. He paused, letting silence settle like a weight in the room. What happens after death? The words echoed, and the hall remained utterly silent, as though every soul present was secretly asking itself the same thing. The moderator continued, his tone carefully balanced between rational inquiry and philosophical depth. Some say death is the end. Their consciousness fades into nothingness, like a candle snuffed out in the wind. Others believe death is only the beginning of another journey, where the soul departs from the body and moves into an unseen realm. But which is true? And how do we even begin to find the answer? The screen shifted again, showing two large images side by side. On one side, a brain scan glowing with neurons firing. On the other, a silhouette of a human figure walking into a tunnel of light. On my right, the moderator said, gesturing, we have leading scientists, neuroscientists, physicists, and medical researchers who argue that the human mind is nothing more than the brain. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. Simple, logical, observable. He then turned to his left. On the other side, we have Islamic scholars and theologians who argue that human beings are more than matter, that we carry within us a soul, something beyond scientific instruments, and that life after death is not only real, but inevitable. The hall buzzed faintly as people exchanged glances. Some nodded firmly, others smirked skeptically. A group of young students in the second row whispered, already anticipating fiery exchanges between the two sides. The moderator raised his hand again. Silence returned. Tonight, we will not only hear arguments, we will hear stories. Stories of those who claim to have seen beyond death, and stories grounded in ancient scripture. We will test science against faith, and faith against reason. Perhaps we will not walk away with proof, but we may walk away with perspective. He leaned closer to the microphone, lowering his voice to a near whisper. And remember this, death is not a theory. Death is the one experiment that every single one of us must undergo. The only difference is, some of us will only discover the answer too late. The audience shivered. It was not fear exactly. It was awareness. Awareness that this discussion was not about abstract ideas, but about their own inevitable reality. From the back of the hall, the sound of the clock striking echoed faintly. Time was ticking, as it always had and always would. The moderator stepped back, and the spotlight expanded across the stage. Let us begin, he said firmly. with science. And with that, the first scientist, a renowned neurologist from Oxford, rose from his seat, carrying notes in one hand and decades of research in the other. He walked toward the podium, his expression firm, rational, almost impatient with the idea of faith. The battle had begun. The first speaker, Dr. Adrian Walker, a senior neurologist from Oxford University, approached the podium. He adjusted his glasses, placed his notes on the wooden surface, and took a deep breath. The spotlight bathed him in white, while the rest of the hall dimmed. His voice was clear, sharp, and unapologetic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. As a neuroscientist, my job is to study the brain, the very organ that creates every thought you've ever had. Every dream, every memory, every love, every fear, everything that makes you you, is produced by 1.4 kilograms of tissue inside your skull. He pointed to the screen behind him, which now displayed a glowing 3D model of the human brain. Millions of neurons lit up like a galaxy. This is consciousness. This is life. Not a spirit, not a ghostly essence floating above us. It is the coordinated firing of billions of neurons exchanging electrical signals. If you damage a part of the brain, the consciousness changes. A stroke, an injury, a disease like Alzheimer's, suddenly the person you knew is not the same. If the soul were separate, why would changes in physical tissue alter personality, memory, or identity? The audience murmured, some nodded firmly, others frowned, gripping their armrests. Dr. Walker continued, his tone firm but calm. When the brain shuts down, consciousness does not float away. It ends. Just as when a light bulb is broken, the light does not travel to another realm. It is gone because the bulb, the physical source, is broken. Death is the same. The heart stops, oxygen supply cuts off, the brain cells dull, and with that, all thoughts, memories, and emotions cease. He paused deliberately. There is no scientific evidence for a soul, no measurable trace of it leaving the body. What people call the soul is simply the activity of neurons. The screen behind him now changed to a medical graph, flat lines across a monitor. Ladies and gentlemen, I know this sounds cold, but science is not about comfort. It is about truth. And the truth is, after death, there is nothing, oblivion, and eternal silence. The hall grew uneasy. A woman in the third row shifted in her chair. A young man scribbled notes furiously, while an elderly gentleman shook his head slowly. Dr. Walker noticed. He raised his voice slightly. I understand many of you believe in religion. Many of you were told since childhood that death leads to paradise or punishment. But belief is not evidence. Near-death experiences, visions of tunnels of light, these can be explained by neurochemistry. When the brain is starved of oxygen, it hallucinates. The light people describe. That is the overstimulation of the visual cortex. The floating outside your body sensation? That is the brain's parietal lobe misfiring. These are not journeys into another world. They are dying brains creating illusions. He closed his file and looked directly into the crowd. His tone dropped, becoming almost intimate. We must accept this reality. We live once, we die once, and that is all. What matters is not some mythical afterlife, but how we live now, in this single, fleeting existence. He stepped away from the podium. The hall erupted into mixed reactions. Some clapped enthusiastically, some sat in silence, and others whispered angrily. The moderator stepped forward quickly, sensing the tension. Thank you, Dr. Walker, for your clarity. Now, to expand further, we invite a physicist to speak. Science is not only about biology, but also about the fundamental laws of the universe. The audience hushed again as Professor Emily Carter, a theoretical physicist from Cambridge, took the stage. She was calm, almost serene, but her words carried the weight of cosmic scale. Ladies and gentlemen, she began softly, I will not speak of neurons, but of atoms and energy. The universe is governed by laws, unchanging, testable, and universal. One of those laws is the law of conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes form. The audience leaned in. Some felt hope. Perhaps she was about to argue for eternal life. But Professor Carter continued firmly. When a human dies, the energy in their body does not vanish. It disperses. The heat of the body returns to the environment. The chemical energy is consumed by bacteria, plants, the earth itself. You do not cease to exist entirely. You become part of the natural cycle. But this does not mean consciousness continues. Consciousness is not some independent energy floating around. It is a function of brain activity, and when the brain stops, consciousness stops. She showed an image of stars exploding on the screen. Every atom in your body was once part of a star. In that sense, yes, you are eternal. You were here before you were born, and you will remain after death, but not as a soul sitting in paradise, as stardust, as atoms recycled in the cosmic dance. The hall was silent. Her words were poetic, even comforting, but also crushing. Religion promises you an eternal self, she said softly. Science tells you, your eternity is in matter, not in memory. You will not remember yourself, but your atoms will live on. That is the only immortality the universe offers. She stepped back. A slow, hesitant applause rose. Some in the audience nodded with thoughtful smiles. Others whispered in disapproval. The moderator returned once again, his voice steady. Thank you, Professor Carter. We have now heard the scientific position, death as an end to consciousness, life as a cycle of matter and energy. Next, we turn to a very different perspective, faith. At the word faith, many in the audience straightened up. Some Muslims, sitting together in a corner, lifted their chins with quiet confidence. Others folded their arms, ready to challenge what was to come. The battle was about to shift. The hall grew quiet as the moderator invited the next speaker, a well-known Islamic scholar from London. His voice was calm but firm, and his eyes reflected the weight of centuries of tradition and revelation. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, science seeks to explain what is visible, what can be measured, tested, and repeated. But life, and especially death, is not limited to what can be seen. Islam does not guess. It delivers divine knowledge, revealed by the Creator himself. He opened a copy of the Quran resting on the podium. The Arabic verses glimmered under the soft lights. Kullu nafsin za'iqatul maut. Every soul shall taste death. Quran 3:185. These words, he explained, remind us that death is not the end, but a transition. Islam teaches that life continues beyond the grave. What the body loses, the soul retains. What the world ends, the hereafter begins. The concept of barzakh, life after death, but before resurrection. The scholar explained that Islam presents a clear framework of what happens after death. The soul, once separated from the body, enters a state known as barzakh. It is not complete annihilation, nor is it the final judgment. It is an intermediate phase, a waiting ground. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that after burial, the deceased is visited by two angels, Munkar and Nakir. They question the soul. Who is your Lord? What is your religion? Who is your prophet? The faithful answer with confidence, guided by their life's belief. The disbelievers, however, are struck with fear and confusion. The audience leaned forward. For many Western listeners, the idea of a questioning grave was alien, yet strangely gripping. In Islam, the scholar continued, the grave is not silent soil. It is either a garden from the gardens of paradise or a pit from the pits of hell. You may not hear it. You may not measure it in a laboratory. But it is real as the air you breathe, though you cannot see it. The day of resurrection. The Quran often speaks about the day of judgment, when every human, from Adam to the last born, will be resurrected. Bones, dust, ashes, all will be restored. The scholar recited another verse. Does man think that we shall not assemble his bones? Yes, indeed. we are able to restore even the very tips of his fingers. Quran 75, 3-4. He smiled gently. 1400 years ago, this verse highlighted the uniqueness of the fingertip. Today, science confirms that no two fingerprints are the same. What science discovered recently, revelation declared centuries ago. If God can recreate the smallest fingerprint, do you think he cannot recreate the entire body? Jannah and Jahannam. He painted a vivid image of the afterlife. Jannah, a place of eternal peace, where rivers flow beneath gardens, where no sorrow exists, where the faithful meet their loved ones. Strong Jahannam, a place of fire, regret, and distance from God. The Quran does not shy away from detail. For some, it is comfort, for others, a warning. The existence of an afterlife, he said, is not just theology, it is justice. Many crimes in this world go unpunished. Many innocent people suffer without relief. If there is no life after death, then where is justice? Islam teaches us that ultimate fairness is delivered by God in the hereafter. H4 paragraph, the soul beyond science. You measure the brain, but can you measure love? You test the body, but can you test morality? Consciousness itself is a mystery. Islam teaches that the soul is Amr min Amri Rabbi, a matter from the command of my Lord. It is beyond the reach of microscopes and equations. H7. He quoted the Quran again. They ask you concerning the soul. Say, the soul is from the command of my Lord, and of knowledge you have been given but little. Quran 1785. The line echoed in the hall. Even science admits, we know so little about consciousness, memory, dreams, and awareness. The scholar's tone softened. He shared the story of a young Muslim boy who died in London. His parents, shattered by grief, found solace in the belief that their child was in a better place, free from pain, cared for by the angels. Without faith, the scholar said, grief becomes despair. But with faith, grief transforms into hope. The audience grew silent, many visibly moved. The scientists had spoken with logic and data, but here was something different, something that touched not the mind, but the heart. As Muslims, we do not reject science, we embrace it. But we also know its limits. Science tells us how the body functions. Religion tells us why the soul exists. Death, my friends, is not extinction. It is the beginning of truth. The Quran calls this world a deceptive enjoyment, but the hereafter is eternal. P. Closed with one more verse, his voice resonant and steady. P. And the hereafter is better and everlasting. Quran 87:17. P. The hall erupted in applause, not because everyone agreed, but because the words carried weight, authority, and undeniable passion. P. The debate was not over. In fact, it had only just begun. The lights in the hall dimmed slightly as the moderator gestured toward the next speaker. This time, it was not a scientist or a religious scholar, but a man in his late 40s who carried with him the weight of personal experience. His story was not written in books or scriptures, nor in laboratories or research journals. It was written on the fragile line between life and death. He began quietly, his voice trembling at first, but gradually steadying as he spoke. Years ago, I was declared clinically dead for 3 minutes, he said. I was in a car accident, and the paramedics tried desperately to revive me. I don't remember the crash itself, but I remember what happened after my heart stopped. The hall grew still. Not a cough, not a whisper. I felt myself leaving my body. I could see the doctors working on me, their faces tense, their hands rushing over my chest. Yet I was floating above them. I saw everything clearly. Then, suddenly, I was pulled into a tunnel, dark at first, but with light at the far end. The light wasn't like anything I had ever seen on Earth. It was warm, it was alive, and there was peace, overwhelming peace. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. The scientists frowned, already preparing their counter-arguments. The scholars listened intently, recognizing familiar echoes of their own teachings. The man paused, taking a deep breath. I saw figures in that light. They didn't speak, yet I understood them. They radiated love. It felt as if they knew me, all of me, even the things I had hidden from the world. But there was no judgment, only acceptance. Then, just as suddenly, I was pulled back, gasping for air, back into my body. He looked around the hall, his eyes glistening. You can dismiss my story as a trick of the brain, a flood of chemicals in my dying moments. But I tell you, it was more real than this stage, more real than the very floor I'm standing on. Death is not the end. I am certain of that. The hall erupted in murmurs. Some were moved to tears, others skeptical, others deeply unsettled. Another speaker, a woman in her 60s, then shared her experience. She had lost her daughter to a terminal illness. In the weeks after her passing, she said, I dreamt of her every night, but those dreams were not ordinary. They were vivid, so vivid that I could feel her hand, hear her laughter. She told me she was safe. She told me not to cry. When I woke up, my pillow was wet with tears, but my heart was calm. Tell me, are dreams only tricks of the brain, or are they doors, small windows into something beyond this life? The audience was split. Some nodded, believing deeply in the reality of these experiences. Others shook their heads, convinced that emotion, grief, and the mind's desperation for comfort created such visions. But story after story came forward. People who had seen loved ones after death, those who had felt an overwhelming presence during their final moments of a relative's life. Even doctors who confessed that patients, moments before passing, often smiled as if greeting someone unseen. These testimonies carried no charts, no data, no religious texts. Yet they carried something else, raw humanity, undeniable sincerity. The moderator finally rose again, his face reflecting the tension in the room. What we are hearing, he said, are voices from the border between life and death. Whether they are glimpses of the afterlife or illusions crafted by a fading brain, is for each of us to decide. But what cannot be denied is the power they hold, the power to comfort, to transform, to give meaning. The debate had moved beyond science and scripture. It had entered the fragile space of personal truth, where logic often fails and faith begins. The hall was heavy with silence after the testimonies. The weight of human experience had settled over everyone. But it did not take long for the clash between science and faith to ignite once more. One of the neuroscientists stood, his expression calm but his words sharp. I do not question the sincerity of these stories, he began, but sincerity is not evidence. Near-death experiences, visions, dreams of loved ones. These can all be explained by neurochemistry. When the brain is deprived of oxygen, it releases endorphins. It creates vivid hallucinations, tunnels of light, even the feeling of peace. The mind, in its dying moments, gives us comfort. It is not the soul leaving the body. It is the brain protecting itself from fear. A ripple of murmurs ran through the audience. The scientist pressed on. You saw doctors from above? The brain can reconstruct the scene from memory, even while unconscious. You felt warmth and love. That is the limbic system flooding with chemicals. Every so-called proof of life after death collapses under neuroscience. What we are witnessing is not the afterlife, it is biology. He sat down, and immediately a scholar rose, his voice charged with conviction. Biology can explain brainwaves, but not the soul, he declared. What you call hallucinations, we call revelations. When the dying see loved ones or speak of light, they are not deceived by their mind. They are seeing what lies beyond. Your science measures chemicals, but it cannot measure faith. It cannot measure God. It cannot measure eternity. You look into the body, but ignore the spirit that animates it. The hall stirred again, voices rising, some siding with science, others with faith. Another scientist leaned forward, his tone more measured. We must be careful. Belief gives comfort, but science must seek truth. To claim certainty of heaven or hell is dangerous when all evidence points to the brain as the source of these visions. We don't deny the experience is real to the individual, but that does not mean it proves an afterlife. The scholar countered, and yet billions throughout history have believed in life after death. Are we all victims of the brain's illusions? Or is it possible that the human soul longs for eternity because eternity exists? You say faith is not evidence, but faith has shaped civilizations, laws, and morality. Science gives us facts, but it cannot answer the deepest question. Why are we here, and where do we go? The moderator raised his hand, but the debate had already grown louder. One side insisted that chemical reactions were sufficient explanation. The other argued that science was arrogant to think it could confine the mysteries of existence to molecules and neurons. For a moment, the clash seemed unresolvable, faith and science speaking different languages, one demanding data, the other demanding belief. And yet, hidden within the tension was something deeper. Both sides were desperately searching for the same truth. A debate had left the room divided. The scientists sat with their data, their logic, their conviction that nothing exists beyond what can be measured. The scholars held their scriptures and faith, unshaken by the challenge of evidence. For a while, it seemed as though the two worlds would never meet. Then a voice rose from the back of the hall. Not a scholar, not a priest, not even a neuroscientist. It was a young physicist. Someone who had spent his life buried in equations and quantum theories. His tone was calm, but his words pierced the tension. Perhaps, he said, we are asking the wrong question. The real issue is not whether science or religion is right, but whether both are describing the same mystery from different sides. The audience leaned in. He continued, quantum mechanics tells us that matter is not solid, that particles exist in states we cannot fully predict. Consciousness itself is still a puzzle. No one can prove how awareness arises from neurons. Some physicists believe consciousness is fundamental, woven into the fabric of the universe itself. If that is true, then perhaps the soul is not an illusion, but a reality science has not yet learned to measure. The words hung in the air, giving even the most rigid skeptics a pause. The scholar smiled faintly. This is exactly what Revelation has been telling humanity for centuries. The Quran speaks of the soul as something beyond comprehension. They ask you about the soul. Say, the soul is by the command of my Lord, and you have been given little knowledge. Your science is only beginning to touch the edges of this mystery. Another scientist, older and seasoned, leaned back in his chair. It is true, he admitted, that consciousness defies our instruments. We cannot put awareness under a microscope. We can observe activity, but not the self experiencing it. Some call it the soul, others call it an emergent property of complexity. But either way, it is the one question science cannot fully solve. The hall was quieter now, not divided, but thoughtful. The physicist spoke again. What if science and faith are not enemies? What if they are partners in a quest to understand reality? Science gives us the how, the mechanics of the universe. Religion gives us the why, the meaning behind existence. Alone, each is incomplete. Together, they might form a bridge. The words drew murmurs of agreement from both sides. For the first time that night, there was not hostility, but curiosity. Some began to see that perhaps the war between science and religion was not necessary, that both were torches trying to illuminate the same dark tunnel from opposite ends. And in that moment, the hall was filled with a strange and quiet suspense. Not because the answer was found, but because the search suddenly felt bigger than either side alone. When the debate ended, the hall did not erupt in applause. Instead, there was silence. The kind of silence that comes when people are lost in thought, pulled between doubt and belief. Every face carried a different story, a different struggle. In the front row, a middle-aged woman wiped her eyes quietly. She was a nurse who had spent years watching patients take their final breaths. "I've seen too many deaths," she whispered to the stranger beside her. "Some leave with fear, some with peace. I never knew why. Tonight, I feel like I finally understand. It's about what they believed." A few seats away, a young man in a hoodie raised his hand nervously. He was a philosophy student, known on campus for his sharp questions and atheistic leanings. His voice shook slightly as he spoke, not with fear, but with honesty. "If Islam is true," he said, looking directly at the scholar, "then I've wasted my life denying it." The hall turned to him. His words carried no hostility, only raw uncertainty. The scholar met his eyes with gentleness. "And if science is true," the scholar replied, "then nothing matters after death. But if Islam is true, then everything matters. Which risk feels greater to you, my son?" The student had no reply. He simply sat down, his face pale, his mind restless. On the far side of the room, another voice rose, this time from a scientist who had been quiet the entire evening. He was an agnostic physicist, respected in his field, but unwilling to align with either faith or atheism. "I don't know about religion," he said carefully, "but I do know that science has limits. We measure particles, we calculate forces, we write equations, but we cannot capture love, fear, or the experience of being alive. Perhaps faith is not the enemy of science, but the part we cannot yet explain." His words brought nods from unexpected places. A group of students in the corner, skeptics only an hour earlier, now looked at one another with curiosity instead of mockery. One of them whispered, "Maybe we don't have to choose sides. Maybe it's bigger than both." Then came a voice that trembled with age. An elderly Muslim man stood slowly, leaning on his cane. His eyes were watery, but his smile was steady. "I was born with faith," he said softly. "I prayed all my life. Tonight, I did not come here to defend my religion. I came to see if science could steal my faith. It could not. Instead, I found that science has only confirmed what my heart already knew, that we are more than flesh, more than neurons. We are souls on a journey." The hall was hushed again, but the atmosphere had changed. What was once tension had become weight, the weight of truth pressing down on hearts. A young Muslim woman in a hijab raised her hand, her voice steady but emotional. "Faith is not about shutting our eyes to science. It is about opening them wider. The Quran tells us to reflect on the heavens, on the creation, on the self. Science does exactly that. But science without faith is like a body without a soul. It can walk, but it cannot live." Her words brought a murmur of agreement from many in the audience, even some who did not share her religion. And then, almost unexpectedly, the moderator, who had been silent all evening, finally spoke. "We began tonight asking whether life continues after death, or whether it ends with the grave. No one here has proven it beyond doubt, and perhaps no one ever will. But something remarkable has happened instead. For the first time, we have seen science and faith not as enemies, but as mirrors reflecting the same mystery. Whether you leave here as a believer or a skeptic, you leave with the weight of the question. And that, perhaps, is more powerful than any answer." The audience rose, not with thunderous applause, but with thoughtful murmurs, handshakes, even tears. Some left with their faith strengthened, some left with new doubts, and some left suspended in between, yet none left unchanged. As the crowd dispersed into the cold London night, the words of the debate lingered like an echo in their hearts. A student walked silently beside a scholar. A scientist shared a coffee with a believer. For once, the divide did not feel like a wall. It felt like a bridge, fragile but real, stretching across the unknown. And somewhere in that night, perhaps in the mind of a skeptic or the prayer of a believer, the search for truth burned brighter than ever before. The night was quiet outside the hall, but inside people still lingered, unwilling to leave the weight of what had just been spoken. The debate had ended. The microphones had been switched off, yet the echoes of questions and answers refused to die. A small circle had gathered around the scholar and the scientist, no longer as opponents, but as two men searching together. Their earlier sharpness had softened, replaced by something gentler: respect. The scientist spoke first, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I still cannot believe in God the way you do, but I cannot deny that science cannot explain consciousness, morality, or even why I stand here asking these questions." The scholar smiled faintly. Perhaps that is faith beginning, not in answers, but in the courage to admit science alone cannot satisfy the soul. The scientist paused and laughed lightly, a weary laugh. And perhaps faith, in the end, is simply another word for humility. Science demands humility, too. The humility to admit how little we know. Maybe we are not so different, you and I. The scholar placed a hand over his chest. The Quran tells us, "And they ask you about the soul. Say, the soul is of the affair of my Lord, and you are not given knowledge except a little." Even our scripture tells us our knowledge will always be limited. That is not weakness, it is truth. For the first time, the scientist nodded, not as a debater, but as a student who had learned something. Across the hall, the young atheist student sat alone, his notebook open, but untouched. He had come prepared with arguments, but they now seemed like shadows compared to the weight of what he had heard. He scribbled a single line in his notebook. "If nothing exists after death, life is meaningless. If something exists, I must prepare. Which is safer to believe?" He closed the notebook with trembling hands. The logic was simple, yet it unsettled him more than any lecture ever had. For the first time, he felt the terrifying possibility that he had been wrong. The elderly man with the cane slowly shuffled toward him. "You remind me of myself," he said kindly. "I once doubted too. But the heart does not find peace in emptiness. It only finds peace in remembrance of the one who made it." The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to argue, but no words came. The old man's faith was not loud, not arrogant. It was quiet, steady, unshakable. And that silence spoke louder than 1,000 arguments. Near the exit, a group of students gathered, whispering about what they had heard. One of them, a girl with wide eyes, confessed, "I never cared about religion. I thought it was old-fashioned, but tonight, I feel scared. What if we really don't just vanish? What if there's something after?" Another student shook his head. "I don't want to believe in hell or judgment. It's too heavy." But a third replied softly, "It's heavy because it matters. Science never made me feel responsible for my life. Religion does." They all fell silent, realizing the weight of that truth. As the hall emptied, the moderator sat alone on the stage, staring at the empty chairs. He whispered to himself, "Science gave us planes, medicine and machines. Religion gave us purpose, morality and meaning. If both are gifts, perhaps the mistake was ever thinking they were enemies." Outside, the night air was crisp. People walked away in groups, still deep in conversation. For some, the debate had confirmed their faith. For others, it had planted seeds of doubt. But for all, it had left a mark they could not erase. The young man in the hoodie walked slowly home. Each street lamp seemed to throw his thoughts into sharper relief. His footsteps echoed the question, what if death is not the end? He reached his small apartment, sat at his desk, and stared at his reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in years, he whispered a prayer. Not sure if anyone was listening, but hoping someone was. Meanwhile, the scientist returned to his office. The shelves of books, the chalkboard full of equations, the microscope glowing faintly, all of it seemed smaller now. He sat down, pulled out his notebook, and wrote a single line beneath his unfinished calculations. We are more than matter. The scholar, too, walked alone. His heart was heavy, but also full. He knew not everyone had been convinced, but that was never his goal. His duty was to deliver truth, not force it. The rest belonged to God. And somewhere in the city, a skeptic lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word. For the first time, the thought of death did not feel like an escape into nothingness. It felt like a doorway he was unprepared to walk through. Sleep would not come easily that night. Days passed. The debate video was uploaded online, spreading far beyond the hall. Comments flooded in from around the world. Believers, skeptics, atheists, agnostics, all drawn into the question that had no easy answer. Some mocked, some praised, but most admitted one thing. They could not stop thinking about it. A Christian viewer in America wrote, "I'm not Muslim, but tonight I feel closer to God than ever. The truth is universal." An atheist in Germany admitted, "I don't believe yet, but I can't deny how powerful the argument was. Maybe I need to reconsider." And a Muslim teenager in Pakistan commented, "This debate made me proud of my faith. I always thought science was against us. Now I see, it was never against us at all." The debate had ended, but its ripples had only begun. Weeks later, the young atheist student returned to the mosque where the scholar often spoke. He stood at the back, silent, listening. Something inside him stirred. He did not convert that day, nor the next. But slowly, piece by piece, the walls of his doubt began to crumble. One night, months later, he whispered the words of faith, with tears in his eyes, not because he had been forced, but because the truth had finally become undeniable. The scientist, too, changed, not overnight, but gradually. He began speaking differently in his lectures. "Science does not answer the ultimate question," he told his students. "It describes the universe, but it cannot tell us why there is a universe at all. That question belongs to something greater." His colleagues noticed the shift. Some mocked him, but deep down, he felt freer than ever before. And the scholar continued his work, not seeking fame, not seeking victory, but knowing that truth spreads in whispers more powerful than shouts. In the end, the conclusion was not written in books or spoken in lectures. It was written in the hearts of those who listened. Science had shown its brilliance, its power to explain the material world. Islam had shown its depth, its power to explain the unseen. When compared honestly, science could measure the body, but only faith could answer the soul. Truth was not found in choosing one over the other, but in recognizing where each belongs. Science explained the how. Islam answered the why. And so the debate closed, not with one man winning and the other losing, but with the realization that denying faith left a void science could never fill. Islam stood not as the enemy of science, but as its completion. The final verdict was not spoken aloud, but it was clear. Science without faith is incomplete, but faith without science is blind. Together, they point toward the one truth: that life does not end with the grave, that death is not destruction, but transition, and that beyond the limits of our knowledge waits the certainty of God. The debate ended that night, but the real journey, the search for truth, had only just begun.